Welcome back to another edition of Crash Coursing, an original series dedicated to sharing the stories of industry leaders in the areas of digital trends in sports. Today, I have with me someone who I very much see as a personal mentor more than I do a friend. He is the co-founder of Digital Media Services, a company that focuses on creating and launching digital media platforms on behalf of some of the world's largest sports leagues and enterprises. Please welcome Mr. Alex Balfour. Alex, I always like to take things back to where passions start from. Take me back, man, Alex, to where you grew up. What was your circle like during your college days? When exactly did you find your first interest in sports?
When I was 15, as a schoolboy in Edinburgh, I went to the Commonwealth Games on my own to watch track or athletics. And in fact, there was a day where I was there when an athlete called Liz Lynch, who's now called Liz McColgan, and her daughter Ailish McColgan is also an Olympic athlete now, won the 10,000 metres, which was one of Scotland's only gold medals in that games, in the home games. And I remember that just being a fantastic day. Roll forward 35 years, and my teenage son, I had a ticket. I was actually doing some work for the Qatar FIFA Football World Cup over the last summer.
Yeah.
I had a ticket for the Cricket World Cup final, and cricket's kind of my passion sport.
Yeah.
And I said to him, "Would you like to go?" And he went, "No, I don't want to go. I don't want to go to a sporting event on my own."
Yeah.
And I was thinking, "You're insane." So obviously, I had a sport bug from a young age, and even though my son plays better level sport than I ever have, I clearly was a fan from a young age, and I was quite happy as a 15-year-old to go to an event on my own. Didn't care whether I had any friends or adults there. So I've always been a big sports fan. I'm a competitor at various levels, but never at the highest. I got pretty useful. I was in at college. I was a rower or crew, so and got to a high standard until I slipped a disc in my back, then ended up having a happy happy coincidence that the time when I emerged from college, which was '93. Was about the time when the internet started to emerge from. I had friends at college who used internet and email, but I didn't really know what that was. And 94, 95 was when the web emerged, and I started chasing around. Actually, my first career as a journalist, with a back injury, occasionally lying at home with a laptop, I chased around on working out what online was all about. Found the things I was interested in, amongst them sports, and got in very early into the mix of all that. So that was kind of the fact that I had a sports injury was the reason why I found out about sports online, and that's been my career ever since, pretty much.
Do you think that competitive nature still stands with you today? Like growing up watching these sports teams go at it at the highest competitive level, is that something that was innate in you from the beginning as well?
Yeah, well, I mean, again, as I said, I'm probably been my achievement as a spectator is greater than my achievement as ever as an athlete. But yeah, I was always quite competitive. And I think probably the reason why I gravitated towards sports in my career was just the itch of never quite doing in sports what I wanted to do. And I'm sure that's familiar for lots of people. And then, as I say, it was just a passion point. It was just obvious for me to want to work in that space. And there was a point when I was working on building the first, or being part of a team that built the first websites for the Guardian newspaper in the UK, which has a very established digital presence now and good reputation. Right. But at the same time, I was on the side chasing around with a group of people who were sharing cricket scores online. And then the traffic we had for people interested in cricket scores was 10 times bigger than the newspaper traffic at the same time. For me, it was just obvious. Let's run with the thing that people want to see online. And that
was your first success story, right? Your first .com success story was that cricket?
Yeah, so I got involved early on with a group of people who were mainly sort of South Asian grad students in the US, mainly Indian grad students who were cricket nuts because Indians are cricket nuts, and who were swapping scores when they should have been doing something else with their research grants.
Right.
and then they ended up finding this informal network that then became this first website, which became CricInfo, which then years later we sold to ESPN and is still running now. But for me, it was, I came in with, I suppose I was the guy with the communication skills, not many tech skills, a lot of guys with tech skills. And we went through the process of working out how to, in fact, we had a big argument about going on the web. in kind of mid-90s, because everyone said, oh, the web is stupid, it has images and they take ages to download, why would we want that? That's nonsense.
Yeah.
But went through that process, and then ended up going through the whole journey of trying to make it into a business, bringing on a big staff, taking on investors, right at the kind of peak of dot-com boom, raised money just at the peak of it, and then the market went flat. But we kind of pulled it through, and for me it was like a kind of living MBA, really. So I had this great experience, which cost me nothing other than sweat and time to build this property, and I'm kind of proud it's still around today.
Awesome. Yeah, we're also proud of you on that one for sure. And beyond that, one of your most notable positions was serving Premier Boxing Champions as their chief digital officer. You took PBC from what was a homegrown promotional company and helped scale their presence really by way of digital media distribution. Talk to me about your first meeting with the organization over there. What were some of the conversations like during your first meeting with PBC? Like, who was in the room and what was presented?
Well, it came back. It actually goes back to, I mean, the role I had before that, which was a sort of career-defining role for me, was running digital for the London Olympics, so for London 2012, which I ran for 6 years, from 2006, not long after they won the bid, until they ran the Olympic Games in London. And that opened up, it was an amazing thing to do, and we built channels from scratch that reached 150 million people. So, it was a significant milestone for me. But coming off the back of that, it opened up some interesting opportunities. In fact, I went straight back into agency work. I was working in an agency in London that was a broad-based advertising agency with lots of different client types. But while I was there, I was headhunted. In fact, I was speaking to a recruiter who had very well known for lots of interesting roles, and they said, I've got this role in boxing. I was thinking, not sure I want to do that, but the recruiter was a good one, so I thought, well, I'll go and entertain this conversation and see where I go. And I had no real background in boxing. Again, I remember as a kid at school, and I went to a boarding school, being allowed to stay out late to watch Barry McGuigan fight in the mid 80s, and since then I've met his kids and others who are now promoters. But obviously boxing was always a big sport in anyone's mind's eye, and remains so. But especially for someone, a kid in the 80s, and obviously before that it was even bigger in the 60s and 70s. But I wasn't that sort of enthused about the idea, but went along, met these guys. So how Premier Boxing Champions had come about is that there were a few guys chasing around some of Al Haymon's advisors, who were thinking that there might be an opportunity to put together a series or to raise some money and take boxing into a slightly different space. And they'd had conversations, and roundabouts, they'd had conversations with different people who were willing to fund, and ultimately hit upon a Kansas fund called Waddell Reed, who a successful fund manager there. They had 50 to 100 billion under management, and a lot of the funding had gone into standard blue chip companies. But they've done some really interesting things with people like Scooter Braun, who's now Ariana Grande's manager. At the time was Justin Bieber's manager, I think still is. And put some money into him. They put some money into casinos in Macau. They bought a fashion photo library. They backed Legendary Pictures, which now has since been sold to Chinese. And then I think the thing that gave them most profile was coming in after CBC, who'd invested in Formula One. So they bought out a majority stake in Formula One, and they were looking to bring in some other partners in there to take on some of that funding and responsibility. And this Waddell Reed fund that not many people at the time had heard of stepped up and said, we're game for this.
Nice.
And so they ended up taking a chunk of Formula One, which is a successful investment. So the fund manager running that, Ryan Caldwell, had a lot of rope, I think, to do whatever that he could put in front of his investment committee. They were interested in investing. So he'd had a long time interest in fight sports, and put up a fund to invest in Al, and put together a property. So initially,
were him and Al like buddies from before, or
no? I think he'd been introduced. I think someone in the mix of this was Thomas Tull, who was the founder of Legendary Pictures, who's I think now has an ownership in the Steelers. He could do.
Okay.
but sold legendary pictures a few years back. So that was the introduction, and Ryan was well connected, and obviously had done his formula. He sat on the board of Formula One, so
Yeah.
he was a name in sport for that reason. So I think that the connection was made. Some of the connection was made through Mike Ring, who's Al Haymon's attorney. So that group came together, and eventually put together on fairly short order, put together an investment note. And I won't go into too much the precise details, but effectively put cash up to then put Al in a position to build out his stable of fighters and to put on fights. And then the principle was really that we'd go out and stage a lot more quality fights.
So you were essentially you started at ground level.
Yeah, so I was basically the first person they actually hired who they didn't already know, who wasn't part of their setup, because they realized they needed something digital as part of this mix without defining what that exactly was.
And did they trust you right away? Do you remember those conversations originally when you were in the room with them? Like, did they know who you were? Were they skeptical of your execution capability? How did you present your case? And
it was an interesting mix because Ryan's a top guy and an enthusiast, and he was taking this from an investment manager's point of view and wanted to hire great people. The other guys, had a background in boxing, so it was it's a different environment and different ways of working people out and working them through. We started off with a bunch of video interviews, then I went over to Atlanta to kind of sound them out, and as I understand it, they talked to quite a lot of execs in sport, but I think they liked the fact that I consistently built things and I knew how to do things at scale and was not scared of starting. They talked to some people who probably had better credentials in running big American sports franchises, but they'd not built anything. They just worked on assets that were already there. So and for me, I love that kind of stuff. It's catnip. I love starting things up or doing things from scratch. So it was that way. And then I went out and met them in Atlanta. It was a pretty short meeting, really. And we rolled from there. But then it took quite a long time to actually, the biggest challenge was getting processed. It was a crazy difference for me coming from the Olympics where everything's hugely structured, tons of stakeholders, tons of kind of internal politics, slow moving machine. Boxing is fewer people, but it doesn't do structure as an organization, as it doesn't do corporate meetings, and I think the biggest challenge for me is that, I say to people who don't know boxing at all, that coming out of it, really through all that time, I probably had half a dozen meetings where we were a group with the senior guys in 3 years. And really, ultimately, I met Al, spent time with Al quite a few times, but I only really had one proper one-to-one meeting, and that took a lot of setup and wait and time. Where I actually got him and me in the room, because there was him and me in the room with others there, but only once did I get a
Why
proper...
was that? So Al does have this brand of being behind the scenes. In your experience with him, is that something that's strategic on his part, or is it something that he just not known to do? Or
yeah, I think a lot of it's strategic on his part. I mean, he ultimately, he's a deal maker. As you know, at the top of the tree in boxing, it's a deal maker sport. So it's this glorious combination of kind of deal making and all the skullduggery that comes with that, and also the sort of romance and boxing fans are in that weird place where they don't necessarily trust everything, but they also like to suspend their disbelief because they love the romance of it. And sometimes you can sort of even sense it in the ring. I would not say I'm a fight expert, but sometimes you can tell when, even if you think they might have been persuaded that it's not a good idea, fighters decide to fight. and despite all the mystery and all the fooling around in the sport, ultimately it's one of the few sports, and I think Al uses this line too. It's not one that you play. You don't play boxing, and even if you're going in there with an agenda, maybe to come out second best in a fight, you still don't play at that. You're getting hit and you're hitting. So and there's no other sport way that's like that. So it's very unique, and and fans respond to that. So it's a unique set of circumstances. But no, I think Al is a deal maker, and he's an extremely smart guy, and he's also can play different types and different personalities, because he's able to sort of weave
Yeah.
his way into
Weave his
different
way in.
through this, and also because his background as well. You know, he has a credible background as a
Sure.
you know, as someone who's come from a tough place and a tough community, as well
Mhm.
as someone who went on his own merits to Harvard. Who, you know, I don't know the stats, but
Yeah.
African American guys at Harvard in 1970, there must have been, you know,
Right.
less than a handful. So
Right.
he's a very unique individual with unique talents.
Well,
And he,
speaking of unique individuals and unique talents, you yourself were working there from 2014 to 2016. You worked exclusively with some of the world's top fighters, invested heavily into online ad spending. Your
yeah,
work, in turn, generated over 100 million views across social and produced over 6 million followers who engage with athletes. And all this was done from scratch, correct?
yeah. I mean, what I knew, one of the interesting things and I think, you know, I don't think we changed the fight game in the ways that I would have liked, and I think it's incredibly difficult to build a brand. Is the truth. Um, you know, obviously, in a parallel space, the UFC has built a brand, but it's built on different dynamics, and not
Mhm.
least because the fighters aren't given much opportunity as individuals to earn, and you know, there's a very different dynamic and structure in the way the thing works. But one of the things I kind of showed the guys on Al early was, you know, this is where demand is, because you look at, we basically did a really rigorous investigation into, particularly into Google search. We found that of the top 50 fighters that people look for, this was 2014, you
Mhm.
know, 20 to 20, at least 30 of them were retired, and
Mhm.
about 20 of them were dead, because
Mhm.
you know, that's where boxing was, and there's still a challenge there that, you know, Muhammad
There's a
Ali
big
will still be
challenge
one of
there. Yeah.
them. So people didn't know who the fighters were, and the
Mhm.
fighters that they knew were not fighting, or no longer even existed. So, but because we knew how to do that, we channeled all that demand, and quickly made sure that, you know, the only competitive site with us was probably BoxRec, which is, you know, where all the stats are.
Yep.
But we were quickly the number one boxing property, and then we worked the social channels really hard. And the first thing we did is we had quite a lot of marketing budget.
Mhm.
You know, we had, you know, significant money for that. And I think I did manage to win trust of the group to say, you know, we went to some media buyers and went to some of the biggest media buyers in New York. They gave us their plans, let them run it for a couple of fight cycles, looked at them, thought, you know, you're not doing the right stuff here. You're wasting our money. So I
Right.
said, I'll take this in house, and I'll spend the money ourselves on social, and we'll build our social properties, and we'll spend against it. So we ended up getting really good
And
at
that
delivering.
move, I mean, that move, like even PBC is recognized today to house some of sports' most prolific athletes.
Yeah.
And in your opinion, apart from them being phenomenal athletes, I think what you did there by organizing an in-house team has a lot to do with PBC's success.
Yeah, I think, and then you know, there's still the guys who I hired are still there, a few of them, and they, you know, they work directly, you know, with some of the fighters, and you know, some of them very successfully, to work with those guys to create social content, to give them profile, then to promote their fights. You know, and I think that structure, obviously, the website and mobile site looks pretty much as it was when I left. So, you know, we put together something really clear and well managed there. You know, I think you know, that gave the brand something substantial that people could see that exists and still exists. And
It still
but you're right,
exists.
also,
Yeah.
but you're right. It's still around a stable of, you know, of a stable of great fighters that, you know, Al was able to build, and because fighters fundamentally trust him.
Me personally, being a proud founder of Boxing First Athlete Agency, I take great pride when I see my work or my programs or my initiatives or my brand activations taking off and become a success story. When you look at PBC's model and traction today, do you ever look at it and say, I could have done that a little bit differently, or I could have done that a little bit better? Do you ever look at them from that angle as the CDO?
Yeah, I think, I mean, what I like to do is build collective property. I like to build properties and teams, and I think we built an entity, but it was really difficult to build a team because that's not how boxing works. You know, I suppose I was always going to be a bit of an outsider, being where I'm from and how I sound and how I look and all these things in you know, especially in what was principally an American entity, and I, you know, didn't have any ambition or expectation to be at the table in negotiating any fight deals or that kind of core part of what boxing is about. But what I would have liked to have done is had the opportunity to build more of a brand, and rather than just what I see more as a collection of fights and fight opportunities under a brand.
Yeah.
So interesting that I think it's unfair to share them, but Al certainly had views about the UFC which were not altogether flattering at the start of the process. After I left, actually, was the McGregor Mayweather fight. So certainly he came to an accommodation, at least in terms of doing a deal that could make some serious money, which is his core expertise. But I think the problem, I think, with building a brand in boxing is that the structure of how boxing has always worked is you build up value in a fighter by having that fighter go through successive fights where he prevails, and ideally, you wait time before you put them into a contest that they might lose, and whereas a pure brand proposition, you might throw a lot of fighters into the mix and not know what the outcomes are, but build it as a brand proposition. Exactly. But that's not how boxing wants to work. So it's tough to move that on.
It's tough to move that on. That's what I'm finding, struggles in the areas of connecting people together to build a system, build brands around athletes, because outside of fight week and fight night, I don't think, including PBC, are doing enough for their athletes. Now, I will give credit to them, along with a few other promotional companies like Matchroom Boxing, for the recent content during the quarantine. They are going to athletes' homes. They're showing their content. They're showing the personal lives, and this is the storytelling that fans want to see. You coming from the world of soccer and cricket, and you see the countries who are behind their athletes. I'm sure that was one of your goals moving into boxing as well, where let's make these American fighters household names. And we are in 2020 now. The world has changed. The consumption model has changed completely. Many digital executives say that the era of pay-per-view and the traditional TV model is slowly coming to an end.
It's interesting. I mean, I think just to go back on the point about boxers' story, one thing we found quite quickly and could show, and maybe one of the only things that I might have surprised Al with, that he might have taken notice of, because obviously he knows fighting in a way I never will. But when we started doing promos, your standard HBO or ESPN promo starts with a long burn into this is a kid from a tough place with a journey. And actually, when you want to promote a fight, especially online, as you know, people online look at something for 3 seconds and then whatever. So you couldn't, especially when you had a whole even with our best fighters, if you weren't a proper fight fan, you had no idea who these people were. And if you start your promo with "this is a tough kid from a tough place," people are like, whatever. That's what exactly. Everyone's like that. So what you've got to do is show them physically show them throwing bombs or ducking punches or whatever it is that they do well, and then it's like, okay, you got my attention now. I might want to know the backstory, but don't give me the backstory as a starter, because I think there was one, I forget the guy's name, but there was one guy out of Florida, I think, who was in Al's stable sort of briefly, who was a college student who was almost fighting to kind of spite his family. But everyone else does have a tough story from a tough place. So it's kind of like, so what, and so you've got to show what they can do physically, and then you can introduce the story. And then I think, but building more around the fighters, I agree, is tougher beyond just the kind of the trash talk and the fighting personality. Interestingly, today I was chatting to someone who built products at Gymshark, which is a kind of startup brand, that's built a lot around influencers, and they have some fighters in their stable. And I think they've been it's quite interesting that they see that as a proposition to build product around, build lifestyle clothing around. And again, as you say, that's not something that that's more like the tennis approach or the Mike Jordan approach around individuals to build lifestyle and clothing and so on. So
why isn't that done in boxing? Why aren't our boxers in lifestyle commercials? Why isn't Deontay Wilder the heavyweight champion of the world, or former? Why wasn't he in a Super Bowl ad? Why wasn't he ever featured in a Kellogg's commercial? What has always been that disconnect?
because it's all about deal making, and it's all ultimately about the fight and the money you make out of the fight. And you know, you might argue that for some of the big guys, the money you make out of the fight is big, and maybe we don't want to mess around with the nonsense of the sponsor deals. But actually, you know, the truth is, the sponsor deals are, you need to present in the way that the sponsors, you know, that you have to be organized completely differently to do that. You've got to be professional. You've got to show media value. You've got to assure them that the fighter is brand safe. You know, it's all those things that
And these are the things that, in your opinion, don't want to be done by the promotional companies in America. Like, they don't care for it.
I mean, you know, I might be talking above myself because they may say they do these things, but from my limited experience, I don't think they want to do that. No, I don't think that's what they're about. They've got enough energy, you know, and they're not huge organizations by either, so they've got enough energy sucked up into just dealing with all their day to day and all the machinations of putting on fights, and they just don't want to go into that space because it's just not their experience.
But you know, even if it's not their experience, I mean, sure, they have this one leverage of, they can say our fighters are being paid, and we see that the fighters are being paid in America. There's no question that Al's guys are being paid, that Bob Arum's guys are being paid, that Oscar De La Hoya's guys are getting paid. We're not questioning the top tier fighters, but boxing isn't just about Floyd Mayweather, Terrence Crawford, or Deontay Wilder. Boxing, you know, is filled with thousands of, you know, B-level, C-level, A- fighters who are only making $20,000, $30,000 a night, $50,000 a night, and only fight once or twice a year. So what else are these fighters doing on their time off is my question and concern, really.
Yeah, I agree. No, I agree. I think there's potential. I think there's potential to, you know, to take a stable or to take individuals who have potential, who can create brand alignment and do stuff with them. Because I think that whole space, certainly from my time in boxing, was very immature compared to the sponsor properties I work with now. I've been working in European soccer, particularly around Champions League and European Championships, and you know, they have very established and very structured sponsorship programs, sales, management. You know, actually, the problem they have is that a lot of the sponsors have is that they want access to talent too, but they can't afford it sometimes because the talent, you know, is so much in demand, and the structures are so clear around them that it's difficult to get access to them because they're being so well commercialized. But I agree. I think there's a gap there that just hasn't been properly presented into the sponsorship and advertising community in the way that it could be. I see no reason why not to. And we've seen it. You know, there are some fighters who, because they can present themselves properly historically, or they're just such big stars, they stuff happens for them. But I think for the rest of it, the structure isn't there.
What do you think of boxing being exclusively on traditional television? I mean, you come from the world of cricket, from soccer, and you've seen some of the biggest leagues establish some of the biggest TV deals. But your expertise is more or less in OTT and obviously digital initiatives. Do you think the sports world and boxing in particular is going to go 100% right to OTT soon enough, and cable television will just be the old AM radio for us?
It depends. It depends on the size and dynamic of the fight. I mean, there's certainly boxing is, you know, when you work with some other properties, there is sometimes a mix for various reasons between the value that they generate. Well, there are two things. One is in a mature sponsored property, then free to air has value because it carries potential to make sponsorship revenue. So you have to assess that against whatever you can make from media rights. But then there's a dynamics within a sport about, you know, how important is revenue to them, how important is long-term growth, how important is having youth engagement. But boxing's usually right out there on the level of, we'll make whatever money we can and we'll take whatever deal pays us the most, and we're not interested in long-term strategic brand or anything alignment. And since we don't have many sponsors, we don't care if there's much exposure if we can make best money out of this. So, you know, that's not entirely. I mean, obviously, the point of the PBC model was that we went free to air to build demand, and the idea was to have a hybrid where you put some stuff on free to air and some stuff on pay-per-view.
Boxing was always built as a product for television, so the TV will have a fee for it, right?
Yeah.
Where are those fees coming from? Like, what I'm trying to get to is, like, obviously it's coming from some source, then the TV people get it, and then the TV people pay guys like Al and Bobby and Oscar and say, here you go, put on your shows. there's obviously a disconnect somewhere because the fans don't really watch it. There's not millions of viewers every weekend. There's not hundreds and thousands of viewers every weekend.
Yeah, there's an audience proposition. So if you can do ratings, even fairly modest ratings, you can run inventory against those ratings, and then that should drive the financial model. But as I understand it, a lot of the boxing model is more run around you pick up some of those fights that you can run inventory against, but maybe doesn't make for a great business proposition unless you throw in the pay-per-view as well. So that you have to have both, and the pay-per-view will make you money, and the rest of it will
just
might loss lead, or might just sort of wash its face. And then it's a question of balancing. At the end of the day, someone like Al wants the networks as far as possible to take as much risk as possible and give him as much revenue as possible, and then they've got to work out the problem of how they get that back, and then they'll push back saying, well, we need to keep this much inventory back for pay-per-view, and we need to keep these fighters in the mix for pay-per-view so that we can guarantee levels of revenue, and then they just carry on sort of running that balance. So I certainly see this because I'm across a lot of soccer rights, is a dynamic is competition between networks as well. So I think networks are in a super tough place, and as we know, the US networks are all really leveraged at the moment, so there's going to be downward pressure on rights. But the thing that drives price more than anything, whether it's in sponsorship or media rights, is competition. So for soccer rights, where there's two big players in a country, and that used to be TV networks, now it can be telcos or mobile companies, or broadband companies, or mixtures of all of those that want to compete. Or sometimes when you've got an interesting dynamic in, say, in the Middle East, you've got beIN, which is the Qatari network that wants to, puff its chest out for Qatar, so they'll buy rights against local competition just so that they can own it.
But you see, those companies specifically that you're speaking of, and these big markets where soccer, FIFA specifically lies in, they can rely on those ad dollars. They can rely on the brand dollars. They can rely on the advertising revenue for these spots. Whereas in American,
not always. Not always. Sometimes it's leverage against other properties. So you have a competitive position where you establish, you say, well, we've got these rights, and therefore that's part of your wider sales package, because you say, then we bring in audience for this, that audience can then come in for other stuff, and it becomes part of a mix. Or you can cross-subsidize by saying, right, we're the broadcaster for this, and look to compensate yourself or charge premium for other inventory so people can get access to that. So that's part of the mix you do. So we've got these premium properties. If you want access to that, you've also got to buy our inventory against this other property that might even be a sports property. So that's where you balance it up. But I agree that I think right now, again, I don't know the current dynamics as well across the US market, but I would think there's a lot of leverage, a lot of networks having challenges. As we know, some of the big agencies are over borrowed massively as well, so that you would think that some of this stuff is going to revert back to probably more pay-per-view to squeeze whatever they can out of it, than relying on a soft sponsorship market where a lot of people have walked away, and so there just isn't people buying ads on the networks anymore to generate revenue against the rights fees.
If Alex Balfour was to ever make a comeback into the world of boxing, what goals would you want to execute for today's fan? Because now that you've accumulated so much data behind the modern day fan, how would you execute these transactions?
I think I'd go back into direct delivery again, and I think there's still a lot to be learned from the UFC model, and particularly the WWE model, around really knowing your fan and driving around specific demand that you can manage through digital networks. So I'm working a lot now with my current clients, as I say, mostly soccer, who are combinations of free to air and paid media rights, but the place which is still underexploited is really understanding their fans and then selling that data directly or indirectly to sponsors, so that they build really strong relationships with sponsors and really put things in front of fans that help the sponsors sell things, but also that fans are comfortable with. And I think there's a lot could be done in building a genuine OTT proposition if someone on the boxing promoting and management side was willing to take that risk. Generally, their pattern is, we'd rather just other people take the risk. make them compete with one another, and then make it their problem how they're going to fund the fees that they're going to pay me through competition. But I think you're right that in general that does look like a much tougher ask now, because the competition may not be there, and the basis on which they can compete, the money that they might generate from advertising may not be there. So going direct to market would seem like a potentially pretty smart strategy. And particularly the amazing thing about boxing is, again, as I understand it, without being a huge student of the professional fight game, that when boxing first went to pay-per-view in the 90s, it was a big punt. They didn't know whether it was going to work out or not. Boxing fans are, they frankly, they're willing to suck up a lot of nonsense. I could use ruder words, but they're willing to watch low quality product and pay for it. And that's a pretty amazing audience. There's not many other sports where you feed them stuff that everyone knows is second rate, and they'll buy it anyway.
But that's the problem with boxing, why it's not scaling, is because most of the boxing fans would just, like you said, they'll just kind of fucking take it, whatever they're giving them, and they'll wait for these big fights to build up, and then they love complaining about the fact that the fight didn't live up to expectations. And that's become like the boxing fan today. And that's the reason why it's not scaling. And I think that's what you mean, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, and I think that's what you mean when you look at guys like Dana White in the UFC, who are building a system where the fans feel like they're in control.
So I think WWE is the really interesting one, actually, because they're much more closely aligned around, of course it's not a real sport and all the rest of that, but they are real in the way that they think about what fans want, and think about how to position their fighters, and think about what bouts to put on when. And there's a lot you can learn from that, because it's the mechanics behind it are clever. You might spin it differently when the fights are actually real, but it's still the mechanics of managing an audience through data is really interesting.
And I think as you move into a market now in 2020 and beyond, how important is trackability to somebody like you to track an audience and see them all the way through, like stuff like purchasing, and to come back and a returning viewer? How important is that in your line of work?
Oh, it's super important, and it's why this is where life's going to get interesting. When I've been party to a rights sale to Facebook in soccer, but they're still testing the market. Been talking to all the other players, but when and obviously Amazon have bought some live rights now, but they start to see lifetime value around those individuals, and if you don't have control of your own data, at some point you'll end up selling rights to these guys, and they'll decide what you're worth or not worth, and they'll own that data. And and I think that sports organizations need to, even the established ones, need to be clear about that, where they're going to stand on that. Are they going to manage their own data and their own audiences? And in the past they could sort of lend them to television, but they still own them. But when you lend your audience for a rights fee to Amazon, and they have data points on every member of that audience,
they need to know that
you may never see them again.
100%.
And also, if you don't really know the value of that data, you've got Amazon who are going to buy. They're buying tennis, and they're buying some other properties on a bit of NFL, and they then look at all this audience, and then they think, hang on, if we create original, vampire flicks, or medieval murder, kind of medieval Game of Thrones kind of stuff, they might find over 5 years, well, the lifetime value of these people who come in for Game of Thrones is actually higher. They do more stuff, and they buy more stuff than these sports fans. So let's forget about this sports stuff. Let's
and in your opinion, like how important is a modern day, like what is the modern day system for a fan's data? It's no longer just your email, obviously, or your postal code. What exactly are companies looking at before they purchase an entire fan base?
Well, it's a good question, and I've been involved in a lot of conversations recently about how you manage that. But yeah, there is email, but once you have a data point on a fan, you can reach them through multiple channels, so social, and paid social, and then potentially through all the online touch points, notifications, and messaging. Then there's ad networks. So what I'm talking about a lot with my clients at the moment is that if you control your your data, you can feed that into ad networks and buy with or on behalf of your sponsors, so they can get all the value that they get out of reaching people across these networks. But the source in it is the data of the fans that you have. So you can get amazing targeting on Google and Facebook and Twitter and Snapchat and everyone
Yeah.
else
Yeah.
without going anywhere near a sponsorship. But you're still reliant on Google, Facebook, Twitter, and others telling you what a sports fan or a boxing fan or a soccer fan is.
Mm-hmm.
If I help you do that and bring to the table data on real fans who are real people we know about,
Mm-hmm.
and then you buy against that data, either finding those people across the internet or lookalikes of those people, suddenly you've got a whole load more power into your buying, because you know you're looking at real sports fans that are real people that we can trace back to a data point, an email address, a login, an app download, and that's incredibly powerful if properly managed. So it's basically, as you said, it's not just email, it's banners, it's notifications, it's personalized content, it's stuff that can appear all over the place. And I think that's where the best operators are starting to realize that's what they can do. They can become media owners, and they can become ad buyers on behalf of their sponsors and their partners, reaching people wherever those people are with the right kind of content that they want to see that's related to the sport that they love.
Yeah, and I think right now, exactly what you so beautifully put has come into fruition really during this pandemic, because now sports leagues are looking for their audiences like never before. They want to see how much has their brand impacted their fans. This is the time to see it. Have you noticed any sincere fans who are still kind of rocking with their leagues and showing signs of, obviously, passion is still there?
So, little secret between you and I've been pulling data out of the back of particularly Facebook and Instagram for the last couple of years from their ad tools. And during the pandemic, I've been tracking ad audiences for a whole lot of sports interest. And I was looking at it with a colleague today. For example, I've been tracking the top 40 soccer clubs in Europe.
Okay.
Real Madrid, Barcelona, and Manchester United have all increased their engaged fan base on social in the last however many weeks it's been, since mid-March, 6-7 weeks. Some other clubs have nosedived, and they've lost half their engaged fan base.
Why is that?
Because I think, for every sporting organisation, your fans haven't fallen out of love with you. They're all online. In fact, more people are on. I think it's because more people are online than they were before, like you and I are today.
Yeah.
So there's more people online, but they're not looking at content related to their club anymore because there's no content. But I think some of the clubs and sports organizations and brands have done a really good job in keeping it live and keeping their fans live and bringing stuff to them and being relevant. And others have just gone quiet and said, well, we're not playing now, so we're not going to deliver anything. Now, of course, some are better resourced than others. But I think it's some have missed the opportunity to maintain that relationship, but also most of them are missing maybe the opportunities that all these people are online and are not getting much. So obviously in the early days, especially brands don't want to be insensitive and start trying to market stuff. Especially don't want to market anything that people don't want to buy. But in fact, I wrote a long piece about this on a website, coronavirussport.com. Just about that this is a perfect time for all these clubs, rights holders, organizations to test this stuff. All your fans are there online, they're bored or worried or not working, and you should be doing lots of little bits of testing to work out what sort of content they do want to see.
Yeah, man, this is the best time to beta test. That's what I'm saying. I'm just saying this is the time to experience this is the time to take risks, huge risks. This is the time to do it, because if you ever wanted to test a model against a captive audience, now is the time. And I feel like a lot of companies are missing out on that opportunity.
And I think circling back right to your point around athletes and representation, especially fighters, is again where fighter personality has been developed. It's usually been about the fight style, or what they're known for, the nickname, or whatever the trash talk is that they're going to run with fight to fight. Is never stepping back a bit and thinking about them as a brand, which doesn't mean it has to come from their inner personality. It's just a model that's going to work for them. And that's something you can sell. You can't really, you can sell trash talk, but there's not many brands that want to.
Brands sell. Trash talk doesn't. Trash talk doesn't win you fights, and especially in the world of branding, it certainly doesn't win you brand deals either. So I agree with you 100%. If you can turn an athlete into a commodity, and here's my thing, Alex, what I do. For me, it's like, do you have a blue check mark? If yes, that's the starting point. If you have even 125,000 followers, 50,000 followers, 60,000 followers, you don't need to go after the Gatorades, the Reeboks, the Nikes. You can still do local brand deals worth a lot of great money, and you can do a lot of community-driven activation and still become a household brand. And that's how it starts, doesn't it? It starts from household brand activations. And then later on in your career, if you become the next Floyd Mayweather, then sure. But a lot of these guys are just training to become the Floyd Mayweather without thinking about the fact that most likely they're not going to be.
Yeah, and you just need to, you need to find something, a space where you can be authentic and have a voice. And a lot of these guys, I think, maybe I'm overreaching here, but their backstory isn't going to sell their ability as a fighter, and it might not even bring people to their fights, but it could sell a brand, because it's something that and a lot of these guys have got really interesting stories, and they've come through a lot of stuff, and they have to go through a lot of stuff just to get into the ring. So if you can package some of that in a way that actually, there's a lot of ways that can work with brands. And obviously, a great place to start with that is to build around charitable initiatives or stuff where they can have a role in a community and build that credibility. And then, that's where you want to get associated as a brand with a fighter. Okay, this guy's authentic. He cares about something. He has a role. He has a position. He has respect. And I want to tap into that.
Yes.
The fact that he also has profile because he's a fighter is really helpful. But the important bit is actually his positioning. It's not about his trash talking, or even necessarily until they get really good about his fighting ability.
Yeah, man. And I think it's equally as important, just as it is in your career, to establish data around leagues and their fans. I think it's just as important for an athlete to start caring about his own data. I have shared with all my athletes, I'm like, set up your own YouTube channel, set up your own TikTok, your Snapchats, set up for a business account on Instagram, learn your insights, learn your audiences, package your audiences and insights together for future, for future brand deals, for future merchandise deals, for future OTT deals.
And what you've got to think about is, I wrote potential of individual athletes to go out and create their own content and become content factories in their own right, and build their own presences. And I think that's right. And I think one of the most interesting examples of that in the European space, who I recommend you look at, is some guys called the F2 Freestylers. So they're two soccer players who didn't quite make it to the top level, but since then went on, started out as coaches, and they're now in their late 20s, early 30s. Mm-hmm. But they got really good at creating content, and their stuff is, they do trick shots and they do
F2 Freestylers.
Cool. Yeah, they're high quality, they're quality athletes, but they just didn't play pro.
Right. So they ended up turning that into.
But they ended up turning that into a content. But what they're really good at is creating content. It's sports content, but they're really good at it. And I've been fortunate enough to have them on a panel in a couple of places where I presented in front of different workshops.
Yeah.
And in fact, a couple of times I went to one workshop where they presented in front of a lot of ex-soccer pros who wanted to learn to get into marketing. And at the end of the session, and these guys were all wrapped, well, how do you do this? And at the end of it, for every one of these guys, mainly because these guys or their kids had heard of them, they got the guy's camera phone out and did a piece to camera, first time, first take.
Nice.
Brilliant. I'll send you one I did for my son. They were just so slick and so good.
Yeah.
And that's what, having that sort of level of skill, not every athlete is going to be able to do that. But if you can combine that with exposure and sporting talent, it's dynamite, because those guys they're creating content that in itself is just funny, compelling, and that's a skill that you can learn. Yeah. But without that, unless you're Floyd Mayweather or someone with huge following, no brand's going to care. And even then, they're not going to care about him for other reasons. But
by the way, for anybody who's watching, the website that Alex was mentioning will be linked below in the description. What you're up to now? What does Alex Balfour have going on right now, and what are you excited about when sports gets back on?
Well, I think it's going to be a while. I think sport's going to be in a strange place for a good long time to come. And a lot of sport is going to be played to fulfill contractual commitments. But I'm not that convinced about empty stadiums as something I really want to watch a lot of. But it's going to happen. But I think we've got a long, tough stretch now before we get back into stadium sport in the way that we've known it for so many years. Other sports, it's a lot easier. Golf and outdoor sports that are distanced, won't look a lot different. But for me, I'm excited about how much, I don't wish this situation on anyone, and it's not a happy time for the world, but I am excited about how quickly this will accelerate some of the digital stuff we've been waiting to happen for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, the stuff I really enjoy now, having built digital brands and created content and managed stuff, is the commercial side, so that finally digital kind of gets its dues when it comes to commercial negotiation. And that's what I'm working on with my clients to really make this stuff work.
I want to encourage everybody to visit the website coronavirusport.com to learn more about Alex's involvement during the pandemic and what's going on in the world of sports. And of course, check him out on LinkedIn. That's Alex Balfour. Thank you for coming today, man. I really, really appreciate it.
Pleasure. It was fun. Thank you.